Hello everyone! In today's video I want to show you how you can use textures with Plushify. If you don't know Plushify yet, it's a tool you can use to create sewing patterns from 3D models. So you can set seams and then Plushify can calculate a pattern for you. You can give names to the individual pattern pieces, define fabric colors, add details, set the size of your project, and then Plushify can generate a beautiful sewing pattern for you. So today we want to use textures to speed up this process of defining the fabrics as well as the details by just using a texture that we have. So let's head over to our modeling software. I use Blender for that. And here I have the model for my Griffin plushie. I have set some seams in Blender to unwrap the model and create a UV map. This UV map is required to create a texture image. You can also see that I have a mirror modifier, so I only modeled one half of the model. And if I go to texture paint, I can now paint on the model and everything I paint is automatically added to the other half. I can either paint on the model or I can also paint here on the image file itself and it will show up on the model. So we have the model, we have the texture, now let's get it into Plushify. For the texture image, we need to export it as well an image. So make sure you're in the texture paint workspace and then you should see this image menu where you can say save as, and then you can just save it as a normal image file. So for example, PNG or JPEG. I will use PNG here. And then we can export the model. For that we go to File and go to Export and then Wavefront Object, because Object is the file format that Plushify uses to import the 3D model. And here we need to make sure that we check this UV coordinates checkbox. This will include the UV map, so Plushify can actually map the texture to the sewing pattern that we want to generate. Since I use the mirror modifier, I will also apply the modifier, and it's always also a good idea to have this triangulated mesh checkbox checked if you use polygons in your modeling. Well, let's export the file and head back to Plushify. Let's create a new project with our model and the texture. You can either click this button here if you already have a project. If you're new to Plushify, your screen will look most likely like this. Then you can just say get started and select the object file this way. Let's select the object file that we have just exported. And now we need to align the model, because object files don't really have a standard which axis is up and front. Here we need to select a model that is positioned correctly on the table, which is this one, and then we select a model that is looking towards the right, which is this one. Here we see that Plushify has correctly identified that this file contains a UV map, and we can either discard it and set all the seams in Plushify, or we can use it and then we can also use our texture image. So let's use the UV map. And here, if we don't have a texture, we can proceed without, but since we have a texture, we can upload it here. And let's upload this PNG file that we have exported from Blender. And now we get two new options, which is either use the colors from the texture. Here we see that the details are missing, so for example the eye. Or we can use the colors and the details. So let's use this because it contains all the fabrics as well as additional details. Plushify will now create this project. And before we look at the fabrics and details section, let's head over to print to see that we already have a pattern that we can basically use. So Plushify has assigned a default name to every pattern piece. So for example, here this is the beak, this is called piece 1. It has assigned names for the colors. For example, this dark slate gray. There are only that many colors and names, as well as extracted details. So for example, here in this piece, we see the eye and only the eye. So we, for example, don't see all the color that is not the eye in this case, to really give us a very clean pattern. Let's check out what happened in the background by heading over to the fabric section. Here we see all the different colors that Plushify identified for the different sections of the pattern. And since this Plushify, we can play around with it. So for example, if we don't want red, then we can just change the color and see how this model would look like, for example, with green accents. And we can, of course, also change the names of the colors. So how did Plushify extract the colors from the texture? Well, Plushify looks at every individual pattern piece from the UV map and then just determines what is the most dominant color. So what is the color that occurs in most of the pixel values of this image file that is associated with this pattern piece. And then this is just the color for this pattern piece. Everything that is not the color of the pattern piece will become an additional detail. So this is how Plushify extracted details like the eye and the nostril. Let's head over to the details section to have a closer look. So here we see that the eye is a detail that Plushify has extracted. And since this is now separate from the underlying fabric color, we can edit it separately. So we can move it around, we can make it bigger or smaller and rotate it. And the other details, as well as the color of the piece, is not affected by this. This is much more convenient than, for example, having to go to an image editor and then having a cutout of the eye and moving it around and needing to make sure that it doesn't overlap with any other pattern pieces. So this way, it's much more convenient to edit the details here in Plushify. And since we have the separation of the base color and the details, we are also not required to have a stable UV map. Like in Blender, when you change the UV map and unwrap the model again, the texture image will no longer fit and colors will show up in the wrong places. In Plushify, we can easily change the seams. So for example, let's get rid of this seam and maybe even change the shape of a piece where we already have details placed, like here for the forearm. Let's remove the seam here and just make the forearm a little bit longer and closer to the body and calculate the new pattern piece. Plushify will now cut apart the model at the seams, unwrap every individual pattern piece and create our new sewing pattern with the longer forearms here. If we go to fabrics, we see, okay, we have now longer forearms, but they still are cut out of a single pattern piece, so the color now reaches more towards the body. And the details are also staying in place, despite us having a new UV map, despite us having a new sewing pattern. And we can, of course, move these details around with the Plushify editor for the details. Now, when we look through these details, we also see this piece here, detail 4, which appears to be just a long like line here at the edge of the back stripe. So what's going on here? Let's head over back to Blender to check it out. Plushify uses the texture image as a source of truth. And if we look here in Blender and enable the seams, we see that there's a little bit of color bleeding from the main body here to the red area. You can also see it here in the texture image. There's some brown pixels bleeding into the area for the red. So Plushify looked at the pattern piece, identified correctly, red is the fabric color for this piece, but there are some brown pixels, so let's create a detail for this section, and that's what Plushify did. But since this is obviously an error, a color bleed from the surrounding piece, we can just remove it and then it's gone. And this way we get a very clean pattern that we can then print. So here we, for example, see our new forearm, piece 8 with the details, and the other pattern pieces that Plushify has created. So that's nice, but this was kind of an easy case for Plushify, since most of the pattern pieces have a solid color. Like there are some details, like the eyes or the nostrils, but maybe you wonder what happens if there's not a single solid color for one pattern piece, or maybe even for all the pattern pieces. What happens if I import a texture that is just a full spectrum of colors? So let's experiment a bit and try it out. Let's use our same Griffin object with the same UV map, but let's not use our texture. Let's use an experimental texture that is just a rainbow, a spectrum of colors. No solid color, it will be very colorful, so let's see what happens. Plushify still is able to import it, and we can use the colors and details. Plushify will now assign and create the different fabrics and details, and here we go. So we see this is now a very colorful Griffin model. Of course, we no longer have the eyes because the texture image did not include the eyes. But for example, here in the back leg, we can see it beautifully, this spectrum of color. And the base color here is this lime thing. And if we change it, we see, okay, there is color here, but if I change it, it's only changing this individual single piece here, this single slice. This is because everything else is occupied by this huge detailed image. So we can actually move it around and move it to the side, and then we see the underlying base color that Plushify assigned to this pattern piece. But basically most of the pattern piece in this case is an image. This is the way that Plushify deals with these situations where you don't have a single color, but a spectrum and a very colorful way to define the color. But we can still head over to print, and Plushify will include all the details, of course, in the printed pattern. And in this case, this results in we have a huge detail for this pattern piece and a small sliver of the fabric color shining through, which of course looks a little bit weird to have all the pieces with like colorful edges, but then some kind of white in the middle. So you can change this by the color display. You can either set it to swatch, then you can see that there's a square indicator including the color for this pattern piece, or you can set it to full color. And then you really get this rainbow-like effect because Plushify will fill the white section with the base color of the piece underneath. And this way you can really create the sewing patterns that are basically identical to your texture. Here, really colorful, and you get the additional details and features Plushify gives you, like piece names. If you set the fur direction, you also get the fur direction indicator. And this way you can really create powerful and visual sewing patterns and don't have to define all the fabrics and all the details manually, but letting Plushify do this for you with the texture import. I hope you find this helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Keep creating and see you next time.